All right, folks are starting to trickle in. Bear with us for a little bit. We're going to just let more people come into the room and then we will get started. But if you're here for the talk on settlements, annexation, and the two-state solution, you're in the right place.
Okay, well, I guess let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our third session in our 8-part series entitled Israel-Palestine, Where We Are, What Comes Next, and Why It Matters to Congress. I'm Khalid El-Gindi. I'm a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, where I also direct MEI's program on Palestine and Palestinian Israeli affairs, and I'm very pleased to be co-hosting today's event and the series with my friend and colleague, Laura Friedman, president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace.
Thanks, Khalid, and thanks everyone who's joining us. Today's session is Settlements, Annexation, and the Two-State Solution. This is, as Khalid said, part of a series. Today, to dig into these issues, we have another outstanding panel of experts. I'm going to introduce them very briefly here in alphabetical order. You can see their longer bios on the website. First, we have Zena Agha. Zena, I apologize, I've been saying your name wrong as long as I've known you. It's Zena. Zena is a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute and previously served in the US as a policy fellow for Al-Shabaka. And I know she's spoken on the Hill a few times in that capacity. Second, we have Columbia University professor and author Rashid Khalidi, who I think most people are familiar with. And third, we have Danny Seidemann, an attorney in Jerusalem who specializes in legal and public issues in East Jerusalem. And he is the founder and head of the NGO Terrestrial Jerusalem. So there should be links going into the chat box for the bios and the websites and Twitter handles for all of our guests. And also watch the chat box during the conversation we have that will follow for links to resources. And if you miss any of those links, don't worry, we'll also post them online with the video of this discussion. Back to you, Khalid.
Yeah, so just to round out the introductions, the format for today is going to be a moderated Q&A led by Laura and me. We're going to put some basic questions to get the conversation started, but we very much welcome your questions from all of our participants. If you want to submit a question, please do so using the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window. You can submit them at any time during the conversation. Laura and I will keep an eye on the Q&A box and try to incorporate as many of your questions into our discussion as we can. Finally, just want to note that this webinar is being recorded. So for those who cannot attend, there will be a video available. If you're having any technical problems or questions about the webinar, please put those in the chat box, not the Q&A box, and we'll try to address those. And with that, let's go ahead and get started.
Great, thank you. So we're going to talk in this first round about settlements. From the outset of the Oslo process through today, when media and pundits talk about settlements, they're talking always about what is going on today, expansion of settlements, new outposts, and that sort of thing, which is all very important. And we'll talk about that in this round as well. But what is almost always missing in that discussion is the broader, I think, understanding of what is the settlement enterprise, as in what is behind the drive by successive Israeli governments and supported and egged on by some Israelis and even some in Congress to move Israelis into the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So Rashid, I want to start you off with this question. And specifically, what do you see as the overarching objective of this decades-long, massively funded settlement project in the West Bank? What are the principles that define it? And how would you assess Israel's success in achieving it? And as part of that, and huge question, I know, if you could address US policy towards settlements, we're talking to Hill staff here. Can you talk about that policy, what it is, how it's evolved, and the impact that it's had? And you are muted.
Been doing this for 11 months. I'm still forgetting to turn off my mute button. It's a big question, and I'll try and be brief. I think that we often look at the granular detail and we rarely look at the big picture. I think anybody looking at the big picture sees that behind this has always been the ideology of a greater land of Israel, incorporating all of Palestine, or at least as much as possible. And settlements are a means to that end. And if we don't see that as the end, we talk about this settlement or that settlement, this encroachment or that encroachment, and we don't realize that there's a larger plan, and there always has been, certainly for several decades. And I think that that means that our approach involves, our approach as Americans, our approach in terms of our government, has involved a degree of willful blindness, to be very frank. Not only have we actually done nothing or very, very little to stop this process, which had an objective and which we never talked about as American governments, as administrations, we actually facilitated it. We provide the arms that protect this project. We provide the diplomatic support at the UN and elsewhere. Moreover, we provide the money in many cases through 501c3s that support settlements. Now, if settlements are illegal or an obstacle to peace or an inconvenience, however an administration chooses to describe them, the fact that contrary to US policy, we are allowing people to not pay taxes and instead send money to build settlements should be an issue. It unfortunately is not. How successful has this process been? It's been successful on two levels. On the ground, in terms of the metastasization of this settlement enterprise, such that 700,000, 600,000, depends on how you count them, Israelis are now living in the occupied Palestinian territories, including obviously our Arab East Jerusalem. And it's been successful on the discursive level. We just don't talk about this larger objective, which this government and several previous governments and a large proportion of the settler movement share. They want to turn all of Palestine into all of the greater land of Israel. And if that's their objective and we're not trying to stop it, I think we're frankly just wasting everybody's time talking about a two-state solution. The people behind this do not envisage a two-state solution. They envisage a one-state solution, which is Israel, and then some disposition of the Palestinians in a subordinate position within a greater Israel. That's what the settlements are about. It's not this settlement or that settlement. It's the whole enterprise, I think.
Thanks, Rashid. Danny, I want to kind of put the same question to you as someone who is an expert really on the ground. You follow these issues probably more closely than virtually anyone on planet Earth, particularly with regard to Jerusalem. So could you address this issue of what are the overarching goals of the settlement project in general? And in particular, what have we seen in recent years, most notably during the Netanyahu government, and as it relates to Jerusalem in particular, because Jerusalem is seen as sort of the big prize. This is where many people believe that a two-state solution will either be made or broken. So tell us about give us your perspective from someone who follows these issues on the ground.
First of all, it's good to see you all. I've had a stock answer for the last 30 years. Lara begins to yawn when I start saying it. And that is the goal of Israeli settlement enterprise in East Jerusalem is to create a critical mass of facts on the ground that will prevent the creation of a border in Jerusalem and maintain a robust Israeli majority. That's true. But for the last several years, it's grossly inadequate to what I've been seeing. Look, Jerusalem remains a binational city. It remains divided, but that doesn't matter because the term that Rashid used, the overarching goal, has emerged. Initially, Gershom Gorenberg's term of accidental empire was appropriate. It hasn't been appropriate for the last decade. It has been a strategic thrust, and the settlement enterprise in East Jerusalem has three major goals. which dovetail with the settlement enterprise as a whole. Number one, it is the fragmentation of Palestine. It is to create archipelagos in the West Bank, but to divide physically between the Palestinian national collective areas in East Jerusalem. This is not merely a geographical goal, because alongside of that, alongside of fragmentation, is the denationalization of the Palestinians. In the West Bank, it is consigning the Palestinians to territorially limited Bantustans. But in Jerusalem, it's the Jaffaization. It's turning the Palestinian national collective, a proud Palestinian national collective, into a vestigial organ. And we'll talk about this when we talk about annexation. And finally, and this does not receive enough attention, it's not only fragmentation, it's not only denationalization, it's the weaponization of faith and the weaponization of history. If you look at the settlement enterprise in and around the old city of Jerusalem, what you see is the creation of an exclusionary Jewish narrative, which is not only exclusionary, it's absolute, and in ways it's incendiary. Look, you don't have to tell me that the city of David, Silwan, is the Jewish people's Mayflower, but it's also a contemporary Palestinian neighborhood which we occupy. And we are weaponizing our history in order to double down on the occupation of these people. It's not an accident that Pompeo finds soulmates in us, because his rapture and our rapture go together. I'm going to give you just one last example. Prosaic, Sheikh Jarrah, okay? Sheikh Jarrah was a settlement enclave where we implanted individual Israeli-Palestinian families. That's not the case anymore. There are a string of Israeli national projects that will basically erase Palestinian Sheikh Jarrah and create an Israeli land bridge between pre-67 Israel and Mount Scopus through Sheikh Jarrah, including a yeshiva in the middle of Sheikh Jarrah, because obviously the Palestinians of East Jerusalem crave more Torah study. Secondly, this is biblically motivated, part of the settlement enterprise of the weaponization of faith that threatens to transform this conflict from a national political one into a zero-sum religious one. But most importantly, look, I've been dealing with this stuff for almost 30 years now. Israel has not engaged in the large-scale displacement of Palestinians in East Jerusalem when I've been dealing with this. We did this in the Mughrabi quarter. I'm willing to face up to history and to the responsibility to history. We targeted individual Palestinian families, but there was no mass displacement. Mass displacement is what's going down in Sheikh Jarrah and in Batan al-Hawa and Silwan. So you have this one area in East Jerusalem, which has been targeted by Israel's overarching goals, which has the territorial component, the historical and faith component, and the humanitarian meltdown. We're in trouble.
And again, I also have trouble finding my mute button when I need it. Thank you, Danny. Zena, I want to turn to you. Can you talk about what settlements mean to Palestinians, both in terms of the impact on Palestinians' day-to-day lives, existence? They see settlements continuing to be built. They face settlers on their roads, the IDF that goes with that, all of that. And also on their hopes for the future. Right now, we're talking on the eve of possible Palestinian elections. We have a new US administration that is making noises about wanting to get back to a peace process. How do settlements affect all of this in the eyes of Palestinians?
Thank you, Lara and Khalid, for convening this, and thank you everyone for coming. I know it's a Friday noontime in February, so it's a good question, and it's also I think a question that's often very overlooked in the analysis. There's often a disregard of the day-to-day impact of what settlements feel like, look like, the experience that Palestinians have navigating a life around settlements. As Rashid mentioned, there are 700,000 settlers living over the Green Line, which is, an astronomically large number. Israeli settlers live under civilian law. Palestinians live under martial law. Palestinians have to take different roads. Israelis get the privileges of moving seamlessly inside and outside modern day Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory. Palestinians conversely have to go through a very exhausting, time-consuming, humiliating, and often deadly series of checkpoints and permit systems, a sort of very nauseating system of bureaucracy. And all of this has been very well established. I think this is even the most hawkish of analysts will say that this is something that's been going on for half a century. I think the more alarming aspect for me is that there's been a huge rise in settler violence. Settlers act with absolute impunity towards Palestinians. That everything from uprooting tens of thousands of olive trees every year, which is a staple of the Palestinian economy, as well as the Palestinian way of life, and to terrorizing Palestinians by letting their dogs on them, running them over, attacking them with total impunity. But I also think, with regards to Palestinians' hope for the future, I think it's important not to fragment Palestinians, because one of the really alarming trends in the discourse that we've seen over the last, certainly over the last couple of years, but really for the last 50, since the beginning of the occupation, is the delineation between Palestinians in the West Bank and Palestinians living in occupied territory, and that actually just means Palestinians in the West Bank, Palestinians living in East Jerusalem, Palestinians living in Gaza, Palestinian citizens of Israel, of which a fifth of Israel's population constitute, and then Palestinians in diaspora who live in exile as refugees. And so, this constant delineation of different Palestinian communities does away with what constitutes a Palestinian. So actually that, the question that was asked, but also the way that Congress, from my own experience, speaking to Congress people, when they talk about Palestinians, they just tend to refer to occupied Palestinians. And that does a huge disservice to both the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian body politic. I'm not, I don't have a West Bank ID. I'm a descendant of a Palestinian refugee. And when Congress speaks about Palestinians, they don't refer to those types of Palestinians, to people who live in exile. So I think, when we talk about the future, no future can be discussed without the entirety of the Palestinian body politic. And so in that sense, elections are actually kind of meaningless. I mean, they're meaningless from what history has told us and how the last elections went down, but also the number of Palestinians and the type of Palestinian who can actually partake in the upcoming Palestinian election is in itself speaks volumes to the fragmentation of the Palestinian community. I'll leave it there. I know we're going to be getting into the nuts and bolts of it.
Thanks, Zena. I want to stay with you for a minute, if I could, and sort of delve a little bit deeper. Last year, we heard a lot of talk about annexation, particularly in the summertime. And there were, there was a sense that formal annexation was imminent. The Netanyahu government was being encouraged to some degree by the Trump administration in that direction. And sort of, people were quite freaked out by that. And that has been suspended, at least. So what does that mean? What does annexation mean on the ground and sort of at the political and legal level? And is it all that different from the actual reality on the ground, which many people just refer to as, informal annexation?
Yeah, I mean, on the ground, not a huge difference. Political, legal implications, massive difference. Israeli moves towards annexation aren't new. That, the remit of Israeli authorities and Israeli jurisdiction with regards to the Israeli settler community in the West Bank have been extended in a sort of gradual, but also in spurts. in laws, in de facto practices, which discriminate overtly on a sort of ethno-national basis between the occupied residents of the Palestinian West Bank, and determined entirely on whether they're Jewish, Israeli, or Palestinian Arab. It's really just as simple as that. And there is a word for that, which I know we will be getting into. But, you know, I think it's also important to situate discussions on annexation within the last 100-year history of Palestine. I know Rashid wrote an excellent book last year, sort of doing a long view of what the last 100 years of settler colonialism mean. And I know that the phrase settler colonialism is very rarely used, particularly in Congress. And so perhaps this is the wrong audience with which to be talking about it. But I think it's important to call things by their name. You know, there has been a 100-year encroachment onto Palestinian land before the creation of the State of Israel and after, before the occupation and after. And territoriality is the driving force of that. It's land. They want land. They want as much of it as possible. And they want the land, but without the people. And Palestinians have proved a very resilient and steadfast community who haven't left their land. And so annexation poses an absolute headache for the Israeli government because it's all the treasures and the promises of the land, but also the other side of that coin are the Palestinian people who live on the land. Referring back to something Rashid was saying earlier, you know, the ideal model, short of another sort of Nakba, short of another mass displacement of Palestinian people, would be a model where Palestinians have some kind of sovereignty or some kind of, you know, a small amount of power, but nothing that resembles any kind of political rights. And I think that's kind of what the conversation around annexation essentially boiled down to. Internationally, it has huge ramifications and huge implications for not just a sort of solution, although I'm wary of the phrase solution because it kind of implies this wave a magic wand and it's over. But it also, I think it fundamentally changes the terms of the debate of what we understand the Palestine-Israel issue to be and where it could go. But also, you know, Israel has been very cautious about what it annexes. It annexed the Syrian Golan in 1981 and it annexed Jerusalem in 1967. But it hasn't made any kind of formal annexation. But life in all of those three localities is almost the same. It's entire Israeli control, it's Israeli domination from the land, from the river to the sea. So I think, you know, in terms of the minutiae, annexation actually doesn't have any bearing on what life is like for Palestinians, what life would be like for Israelis, or in terms of how any kind of, you know, the Palestinian Authority is kind of very much just a puppet, as it were. It has no real sovereign power. If the Israelis wanted to march into Ramallah tomorrow and capture it, they could. But I think it still presents a fig leaf of autonomy, a fig leaf of, you know, democracy or whatever you want to pretend it is in the West Bank. Annexation does away with that, and annexation is a sort of ugly face of what the Israeli government has been wanting to do. So I think, you know, its importance varies according to who you're talking to and how you talk about it. I think since, you know, this is a meeting with congressional members and staff, you know, I think annexation will have huge implications, but in terms of how it could manifest for Palestinians, not so much.
So thank you. Rashid, I want to follow up on those comments specifically. You know, there has been, Zena referred to, there's a word for that. So let's get into what that word is. There's been a lot of discussion of whether, irrespective of whether Israel formally, legally annexes, legally under Israeli law, the West Bank or parts of it, whether or not it is time to be using the term apartheid to describe the situation in the West Bank. And that's a term that's been used by Palestinian analysts for years. It was more recently, there's a report from Michael Sfard and Yesh Din making the argument that irrespective of annexation, it's already apartheid in the West Bank. But it's also a term that's been used for years to describe, as Zena said, the area from the river to the sea, where you have Israeli control over the whole thing. And again, that's been used for years by Palestinians. It's become more of a discussion now because the Israeli NGO B'Tselem issued a brief making this argument just recently. So can you talk about this question and specifically how the settlement enterprise, whether it's de facto or de jure annexation, fits into it? And again, we're talking to congressional staff, and how this looks maybe for people sitting in congressional offices where increasingly the word occupation is seen as too politically charged to use.
Yeah. Well, let me start by, I'll start where Zena ended, which is to say that I think we have to call a spade a spade. Israel has had absolute security control and all of the components of sovereignty over the entirety of what used to be mandatory Palestine since 1967. There is one security control over the entirety. You cannot go in or out without Israel's permission. You cannot import or export without Israel's permission. The fiction of a Palestinian authority is, as Zena said, really not much more than a fiction. In that space, there are two sets of laws. There are two entirely separate legal systems. Again, as Zena mentioned, there is a constitutional legal system with a high court and with all kinds of other protections for people's rights for Israelis. And then there's a system of martial law, the old joke, martial law, it's not real law. Nobody is ever found innocent in that system. Everybody is always guilty. It's a system designed to further occupation and settlement and the absorption of the occupied territories. Now, you can call that whatever you want. When you see that it's complemented by two road systems, by two health systems, which are completely separate and completely unequal, most recently illustrated by the fact that Israel has just as of today reached over 47% vaccination, first dose of its population, and the population under its complete control has reached 0% vaccination. You can see that we're talking about two completely different worlds under one sovereign, under one security umbrella, under one state. There's one state there from the river to the sea. Now, you can call that what you want. You can call it apartheid. You can call it Jim Crow. Separate but unequal has multiple names. And I think this one, in some ways, combines the worst of both of those systems. If you go back and look at segregation in the South, and you look at the past system and other features of apartheid, you'll find that there are bits and pieces of each in the Palestinian case, as far as the occupied territories are concerned, with multiple variations. But I don't think the word is that important. I think the fact that it is fundamentally unequal, fundamentally discriminatory, in terms of our values as Americans, in terms of the United States purportedly favors universal human rights. Well, where are universal human rights where you have one set of rights for one group of people based on religion or ethnicity or their passport, and a much diminished set of rights for another group of people? And this is not a temporary situation. Half a century, 3 generations have lived under this. I think we have to see it, again, holistically, as part of a broader systemic process whereby the entirety of the country is taken under a sovereignty which is essentially designed to serve one group and one people, and is doing that at the expense of the security, the life expectancy, and of course, the rights of another group of people. This is particularly true, obviously, in Gaza and in the West Bank, but it's really true with different levels throughout Israel-Palestine. And I think we have to, call a spade here. Whether we decide to use the term or not, I don't think really is important. But for Americans, when we look back at the history of Jim Crow, I think we'll see some elements that are, strike us as very, very familiar. And South Africa is not the only settler colonial regime. There are others. You can look at the way in which Algeria organized the relations between French, Metropolitan French, and the Algerian indigènes, the natives. And in every case, the whole basis of it was inequality. And I think that's what we should talk about: inequality, systemic discrimination. And this latest scandal about vaccines, I think just brings it home. Some people are going to die because they have one ethnicity, and some people are going to live because they have another, because of decisions made by the single authority that controls everything important about the lives of both peoples. And we have to think as Americans, and those of you who are listening who work in Congress, I think have to think about our responsibility as a country for the perpetuation, the funding, and the protection of this structural system of inequality.
Thanks, Rashid. I want to turn to Danny and ask you to sort of zoom in for us this picture that's been painted about the settlement project and separate and unequal, and let's focus it in on Jerusalem, where we have had actual de jure annexation in addition to the parallel process of de facto annexation in the West Bank. So Jerusalem is in a lot of ways is sort of the precedent. So how has annexation worked in Jerusalem? And particularly this point about separate and unequal, because Palestinian Jerusalemites have conditional residency rights, but of course are not citizens of Israel, even though the areas they live in have all been annexed. And the second part of my question is, what does all of this mean for the two-state solution, which is the centerpiece of American policy and has been, except for the brief era of Donald Trump, has been U.S. policy for at least 2 decades. So where are we in terms of a future two-state solution? And if you could touch on, because I know Jerusalem is also, we talked about how it was the sort of make or break locale. There are what you've referred to as doomsday settlements, the ones that almost single-handedly would destroy any chance of 2 states. So could you talk about, I know that I'm throwing a lot at you, but if you could break it down for us. You're muted.
I'll do my best. Israel annexed East Jerusalem on June 27th and 28th, 1967. But it's a bizarre annexation. We annexed the land of East Jerusalem, some 70 square kilometers. That was Jordanian East Jerusalem, about 7 square kilometers, and then a lot of villages around it. But we didn't annex the population. We didn't impose citizenship. We didn't offer citizenship. The Palestinians did not want citizenship. The Palestinians of East Jerusalem are not citizens of Israel, do not have the right to vote for the Knesset. They don't want to vote for the Knesset. They don't want equal rights in Israel. They want to be rid of our rule, which is occupation. They don't have Israeli passports. Laissez-passer. My Palestinian friends, when we go off to conferences to meet with Rashid, I don't need a visa. I'm an Israeli. Palestinians have to sweat in order to be able to get there. Lara, you know how long I have resisted using the A word, apartheid. And Khalid, you've been very kind about avoiding it, but I'm going to voluntarily step in a landmine. The fundamental truth about Jerusalem is that there are 2 national collectives in the city, one of which is politically empowered and the other of which is politically disempowered permanently. It's not that the Palestinians don't have rights. They have alienable rights. They're a function of our magnanimity. You have the right to your property unless we really want it, and then we'll take it away from you. You have the right to live in Jerusalem unless we decide we don't want you to live in Jerusalem. By the way, there's an exception, and I'm glad that Rashid pointed this out. It's the healthcare system. Palestinians of East Jerusalem are getting vaccinations. And I'm pointing this out not to make Israel look better, which, by the way, as a Zionist, and I'm a Zionist and an Israeli, and I want my country to be worthy of my love, the Israeli healthcare system is egalitarian. And this displays the realm of the possible. It's not utopian to have an egalitarian system. Our healthcare system is a fair approximation of that. I've been following and avoiding the apartheid discussion. I agree with much of B'Tselem's report on the West Bank. I disagree with a good deal of it regarding pre-67 Israel, although I see demerits to some of the arguments. But nowhere is the argument for Israeli apartheid more applicable than in East Jerusalem. I never thought I would say that, because we've declared this to be a permanent situation. And a house divided against itself cannot stand, half occupied and half free. And that's what we are, half occupied and half free. I want to try and caution about taking the lessons of East Jerusalem to the West Bank. I never thought Netanyahu wanted annexation. Lara, remember our meetings in the White House in 2013. This is about de facto annexation, and Netanyahu feared that the jure annexation would jeopardize de facto annexation. And that is what we're witnessing. We are not going to see the incorporation of large numbers of Palestinians into Israel in the framework of the jure or de facto annexation. We will gerrymander Area C in order to get rid of some of the Palestinian neighborhoods. We will encircle some of the others and connect them by umbilical cords, and we will expel others like those in Susia and in Khan al-Ahmar. So I would highly suggest not fighting the last war. The annexation of the West Bank is not a theoretical question. It's happening. It's there. I see it every day. And whether it's done de jure or not done de jure, but let's not fight the last war. You're not going to have a situation of this purported, Jerusalem, the undivided capital, shucks, we all get together and off into the sunset, kumbaya. I'm going to answer your question on the doomsday and the border. Look, my life goal is ending occupation because I believe that the long-term viability of the third Jewish Commonwealth, that's a euphemism for the Zionist enterprise, depends on ending occupation, and Palestinian freedom and viability does so as well. I wish I could see another way of ending occupation other than a border, but I can't. So I'm still going to try and fight to keep the possibility of creating a border, not because I want rid of Palestinians. Rashid, when we met in 1993 or 1994, I've come a long way since then. I want to share a homeland with the Palestinians. I'm a cultural one-stater, but I don't see how I can stop occupying you except by means of a border. And as a result of that, I'll fight all settlements, but I will prioritize the combat of settlements that threatened the possibility of at some point in the future creating a border. And believe me, I have no delusions. I know I won't live to see it, but I'm going to still keep at it.
So thank you, Danny. I want to stick with you for a second. I think you covered, I had a question about the two-state solution. I think you've covered your thoughts well. I want to impose upon you, you and I have worked together for many, many years, and we've wandered through Washington meeting with people, and we've wandered even through Europe meeting with people. I want you to talk a little bit about the role, not just of Congress, but of the U.S. Support writ large, whether it is the Jewish community. I see you on Twitter. You are fearless in taking shots at what you see as the hypocrisy of AIPAC and others. Whether it's groups like the JNF, which this is the Jewish National Fund, which this week is basically coming out and taking off the masks and saying we absolutely support settlements. We always did, but now we're doing it openly. And even as something that you flagged for me 15 years ago to start watching was the rise of the evangelical support for Israel and that influence in Congress. Can you talk about the role that this plays specifically with settlements as sort of the obstacle to getting to an agreement ever, but also in your mind as someone who sees yourself as an Israeli patriot, and these are seen as the pro-Israel forces. Can you just take a moment and address all that?
I'll try. I think I'm stealing this allegory from you, Lara. I steal from Khalid mercilessly all the time. Um, Turning a blind eye to the Israeli settlement enterprise is akin to being the wealthy uncle who subsidizes your crack addiction instead of you sending us off to rehab. Tamir Pardo, the head of our Mossad former, who is no dove, trust me, he's no dove, has said, Israel confronts one existential threat to its existence in this generation. It is not the Iranian nuclear capability. We have responses to that. It's not 120,000 Hezbollah rockets, it's occupation. Israel cannot survive as a perpetually occupying power. And you can't get the word occupation into the platform of the Democratic Party? Are you kidding me? You're not helping us. You're subsidizing our crack addiction. I'm not an American. I'm a former American. I followed the discussion on denying Israel military aid. And yeah, I wouldn't frame it that way. Hold us accountable for our sake, for the sake of the national interests of the United States and its values, but ours as well. Now, that required a great deal of courage in the past. And we have friends who jeopardized their career, and some of them who sacrificed their career for doing the right thing. That's not needed anymore. The sands have shifted. They've shifted in American public opinion. They have shifted, especially among the younger generation, and they've shifted among the American Jewish community. There's breathing space. Seize it. Don't agree with me. Tell us the truth. Because if there will not be Israeli accountability for the way we are destroying the possibility of any kind of future political agreement, you're not doing us any favors, you're not doing the Palestinians any favors, and you are undermining the vital national interests of the United States. You can say that today with impunity, but it needs to be said. I'm considered to be a Jerusalem expert. I'm an expert on the mechanics of occupation in Jerusalem. An exclusively Israeli Jewish Jerusalem is a disaster for all of us. There are two national collectives here, and there has to be some kind of parity. And Jerusalem has to be put back on the table, and that's not a slogan. Putting it back on the table means we will negotiate how to share this city equitably, in which no community, national or religious, has to struggle to maintain its identity or the integrity of its institutions or its holy sites. That's a discussion that is possible today. Lara, it wasn't possible 4 years ago. It's possible today. Have that discussion. Disagree. I'm gonna just close. I've been following Lindsey Graham for a while. On a Shabbat afternoon, about 5 years ago, a bunch of us, Lindsey Graham, John McCain of blessed memory, Zichrono Livracha, myself, and Yael, my daughter, went out and around in East Jerusalem. And at the end, it was riveting because they were enormously suspicious in the beginning, and they became extremely engaged during the course of the afternoon. It was about 3 hours together. And at the end, John McCain asked me, "What do you want from us?" I said, look, I don't expect you to allocate funds or to pass a resolution. I don't expect you after 3 hours to agree with me. But you are a member of the most prestigious club in the world. You're a senator, and you have allowed yourself to be bullied into the parallel universe of a non-existent United Jerusalem. Give me a break. You know that's false. All I'm asking of you is, you know that the conversation that we had today on a Shabbat afternoon in Jerusalem would be politically suicidal in Washington. Make this conversation possible. And I beseech our friends on the Hill, make this conversation possible.
Great, Danny, thank you. Turning to Zena, of course, if you want to give your own kind of prognosis and diagnosis of where things stand as far as two states, please do that. But I wanted to also ask you specifically about the ICC. As you know, the International Criminal Court recently issued a ruling declaring that they did have jurisdiction to look at potential war crimes by Israelis and Palestinians in the occupied territories. Obviously, the reaction here in the United States and certainly in Israel was quite negative. But a lot of people think that what Israel is actually more worried about is not having its military generals or politicians dragged before The Hague, but that Palestinians might take the issue of Israeli settlements, which under international law are considered a war crime, building sort of illegal settlements as a violation of international law. So can you talk about that? What is that about? What is the potential there in terms of the ICC conducting an investigation? And what is the case for or against allowing the ICC to look at something like Israeli settlements?
You're absolutely right, Khalid. The establishment of settlements on occupied Palestinian land is a violation of Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. At present, we've mentioned there are about 700,000 settlers living on occupied land. But it extends further. The occupying power has to provide a set of provisions, which they don't do for the occupied population, and that includes healthcare. That also includes things like adequate water facilities, and water is one of the final status issues. And also, as we move into an increasingly the era of climate breakdown, this takes on a whole new perspective. I think what's been very interesting in the ICC outrage, the frothing of the mouth, it kind of demonstrates almost definitively that we live in a world where Israeli Jews are convinced that the international community will do absolutely nothing to sanction them. They perceive the status quo, which Danny has been laying out, as utterly sustainable, as permanent, and profitable on top of that. It's an oft-cited statistic, but they say that 2/3 of Israeli Jews don't actually believe that the West Bank is occupied at all. So I think, the ICC announcement is actually a bit of a reality check. Hopefully, if anything else, it's just a reminder to the Israeli state that, the world is watching and the world can hold you accountable. At least so goes the theory. In terms of the US response to it, I think this is very much in line with a very traditional approach by numerous US administrations towards Israel, which is positing itself as a broker of peace and as the deliverer of the two-state solution, and as when actually it's an extremely dishonest broker, as we see time and time again. You can't have an honest broker that gives $3.3 billion in unearmarked aid every year to one of the parties. But Biden, he's said that he'll reverse some of Trump's moves, ending the Palestinian mission to DC being one of them, US aid to Palestinians being another. But I suspect a lot will actually stay the same. And I also think, the US context, I was living in the US up until the beginning of the pandemic. Biden has a lot on his plate to be dealing with. I don't think Biden wants to actually do anything on Palestine other than just hope by maintaining some kind of perverse status quo that everything will stay the same. He won't have to look at it, and he can deal with problems at home and problems in other parts of the globe. I don't think he has the time, the will, or the capacity to actually push for any sort of progress towards the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And I think as far as actually his track record is not excellent on Palestine at all. And I think as far as understanding this current Israeli administration, this goes well beyond anything that Biden will actually want to be dealing with. I think he will adopt a similar approach to what the EU has been adopting, which is essentially just like keep the corpse of the two-state solution somewhat alive, pretend to be talking about something meaningful, and just hope that, you know, eventually some kind of miracle will arrive and everything will go away. The ICC announcement was very welcome. I'm not somebody who pins her hopes on international law to deliver the Palestinians at all. You know, I think international law has actually been very clear. You know, extrajudicial killings, as we saw during the Great March of Return, the building of settlements, all of these things, these have been violations of international law for decades. And international law hasn't been able to actually get us out of this quagmire. You know, I think it's useful insofar as a tool. The law of occupation offers us some really tangible things to hold on to. The apartheid framework offers us something very tangible to hold on to. But I think, you know, just in the interest of being realistic here, you know, we can try and resuscitate two-state solution for all it's worth. We can try and hold on to the legal frameworks which may protect Palestinians. But fundamentally, this is a question of political will. There's not the political will in the West to actually change what is happening or to hold Israel accountable in any sense. And actually, you know, Palestinians have been very vocal and very clear about what they've wanted for decades. And it goes beyond just talking about what happened in 1967 and the current state of occupation that we're in, which the international legal framework offers some answers to, but actually it goes back to what happened in 1948 with the Palestinian Nakba and the Israeli War of Independence. You know, 750,000 Palestinians were forced off their land. And of course, the United States as a settler colony understands well what it means to get rid of your natives. That's exactly what Israel tried to do with the Palestinians, with varying degrees of success. And I think Palestinians have proved that they're not actually going anywhere. So we can talk endlessly about the two-state solution, we can talk endlessly about a border, we can talk about all these things, but Palestinians have said in a very loud and clear voice that that's not enough, that what they want is the right of return to the lands from which they came, that getting sort of any kind of equality in regards to getting citizenship or some kind of parity with their Israeli neighbors is not actually a desirable outcome. What they want is freedom, what they want is justice, what they want is equality. I mean, these are exactly the kinds of things that Indigenous Americans have been calling for, that African Americans have been calling for, that marginalized communities all over the world have been calling for. It's not a new or a hot take. This is something very clearly it's a human calling for freedom and for justice. And so I think kind of fetishizing the international community, international law, fetishizing the idea of, you know, the Biden administration or any other forthcoming Democrat or Republican administrations to deliver us from this question of the Palestine-Israel issue, really does a disservice to Palestinian voices which have been calling for decades for very simple and clear rights. And I think it's, you know, it's time to just be brave and honest and take it for what it is rather than make it something which it isn't. And actually, you know, just to Danny's point about where you know, regular Americans are, they do not support Israel as wholeheartedly as they once did. There is a movement, particularly across US campuses, and we wouldn't have seen the pushback of the last administration towards students had there not been momentum on campuses. You know, Jewish Americans no longer support Israel in its current formation. Younger Democrats don't understand what's happening. You know, this is something which the American people themselves are seeing as incorrect and seeing as wrong. And we have this old guard of politicians who think, no, actually, we're just going to continue flogging a dead horse until hopefully this will either go away or some kind of miracle will deliver us. And of course, you have a willing partner to speak to in the form of the Palestinian Authority, who actually have next to no power whatsoever. And, you know, and we keep going around in circles. And during my time doing work on the Hill, I was astonished at the total lack of accountability, the total sort of, I'm not sure how to say this, but this idea that you can have an entire conversation about the Palestine-Israel issue and never speak to a Palestinian. You know, that you think it's acceptable to have these discussions, but actually the indigenous people, the Palestinians, some of the most educated people on these issues who've been saying these things for decades, have absolutely no right to be part of the conversation. For me, just blows my mind. I mean, the Orientalist, the racist discourse around Palestinians on Capitol Hill, amongst other places, is mind-boggling and explains exactly what is happening. You know, I once had a staffer in LA tell me that, I'm sorry, but your family won't be returning to the Galilee. I mean, that level of entitlement has actually just astonished me. And, you know, it's not just the US, you see it in the UK, as you can tell, I'm a sort of British subject. You see it across the European Union, you see it all over. There's a total discrediting of Palestinian agency, of Palestinian voice. But Palestinians have proved time and time again, as we saw with the Great March of Return in Gaza, as we see daily with everyday acts of resistance across historic Palestine, Palestinians don't accept it. The call for freedom will continue. And I know I feel like I'm kind of proselytizing a little bit, but I think it's an important point to make, particularly because we have such sort of hopefully powerful people who are able to really listen to what's being said. So yeah, that's the hill I'll die on, I suppose.
Thank you, Zena. And I'm actually going to steal Danny's line. Danny has a quote from Faisal Husseini, I believe, talking about you Israelis are creating facts on the ground. We, the Palestinians, are the facts on the ground, and not going anywhere. It's a powerful framing. Rashid, I want to come back to you. You know, the prospects, the credibility of the two-state solution for a lot of people are waning, have been waning for a long time. And for a while, we've been hearing this, you know, there's been an almost an industry of creative ideas. So if two-state solution is impossible, what can we do instead? And some of these solutions come from far right-wing politicians in Israel who are just trying to find a new way to say apartheid or greater Israel and some diminished status for Palestinians, but we'll call it democracy. But there's also solutions coming out from both Israelis and Palestinians, sometimes together, for things like confederation, which I bring up because it was actually in the New York Times last week. There was a joint Israeli-Palestinian piece on the confederation idea. And I want you to talk about this, all of this thinking, whether it's from the right, the left, the center, for things other than a two-state solution, are predicated on the idea that the only practicable solution is going to be one that lets the settlers, not just, you know, most of the settlers, but most of the settlements stay in place. We have to find a way to deal with the realities on the ground today and move forward. And I'm thinking about what Zena was just saying. It's not just about equality, it's about rights, it's about justice, it's about equity. I've learned that language in recent years from my friends here in the United States working for it, not just equality, but equity. So how do you see these alternative solutions being spun as the pragmatic way forward? Are they pragmatic? Are they solutions if they don't deal with the equity issues of the past 50 or 100 years and just try to deal with some idea of equality moving from this point forward?
Well, I think it depends on what you think the realities are, whether whatever solution you envisage embodies those realities. I think Zena has very eloquently laid out a reality that is all too frequently forgotten, which is the Palestinians were supposed to have disappeared. They haven't disappeared. There are as many Palestinians in the territory between the river and the sea as there are Israeli Jews, maybe more, maybe a little less, approximately the same numbers. That wasn't supposed to happen. Herzl said, we will spirit them across the frontiers. It didn't work. That's a reality. Palestinians are fragmented by their enemies. They're divided up and chopped up, but the imaginary Palestinian community is probably stronger in 2021 than it was in 1921 or in 1971, at the time when the PLO was at its height. People are very, very connected, especially young people, in ways that are, to me, astonishing as an old person. And that's a reality. We don't maybe want to take account of it as realists, as pragmatists, as people who have to deal with policy, those of you who are going to have to craft legislation, but that is a reality. Ignore it at your peril. The Arab people support the Palestinians. Their rulers don't, but remember, their rulers were, most of them, not elected, represent nobody except the kleptocratic elites that, unfortunately, our policy in many cases helps to keep in power. So, the Arab people support the Palestinians, busy though they are with the problems that they deal with. The Palestinians are as united as ever in terms of as a people, as a community, and they're not going anywhere. So the long-term realities are not just 700,000 settlers who don't want to move. The realities are the Palestinians are not movable without some horrific, outcome. And that brings us to pragmatic stuff. And the first thing I would say is the pragmatic thing that really bothers me the most is anybody who talks about a two-state solution has to talk about how the United States has done nothing to prevent Israel making a two-state solution impossible. If you want a two-state solution, you stop all of those actions systematically designed to make a two-state solution impossible. The things that Danny talked about, the fragmentation, the building of settlements so as to prevent contiguity, the myriad ways in which a two-state solution has been systematically cemented out of reality, in many cases with our money, with our guns, with our F-16s and F-15s and F-35s now. And I don't think we can escape that discussion. If people want to bleat about a two-state solution, they are free to do that. How do you prevent the cementing over of that two-state solution with our cement, American guns, American diplomatic support? That's the first thing. The second thing is, we want to talk about a solution. I think we have to go from where Zena ended, which is to say whatever solution, one state, two states, however many states you think can dance on the head of a pin, federation, confederation, Palestine, Jordan, Israel, Palestine, it has to have some basic principles of equality and justice and historical reconciliation. Historical reconciliation means you do what the United States is and some former colonial powers and some settler colonial projects are beginning to do, which is to recognize our roots and where we came from and how we deal with the issues that emerge from that. Israel has to do that, the Palestinians have to do that. And you have a solution which is based on inequity, which is based on discrimination, which is based on injustice, which is based on one set of people having property rights and another set of people, exactly as Danny said, having contingent property rights. It's your property until I choose to take it from you, in which case might makes right and I take it from you. I am all for the idea that property rights are sacred. We're not in a socialist society where property is communal. We're in a society where private property is actually absolutely sacred, except in Palestine. So some private property is sacred and some is not. And I think those are the kinds of principles. I'm all in favor of people living where they want in Palestine, anywhere in Palestine, Israel. But that means everyone. That means not just someone who has a faith commitment or belief that the land of Israel is their homeland, but someone like me who can't go there without permission from the Israeli security authorities, or Zena, or any person who doesn't have an ID. And those IDs, of course, can be removed at will. You do something they don't like, you're booted out, you lose your residency, or you lose your... those are the kinds of inequities that have to be dealt with systematically at base in terms of structures before we really talk about a solution. And any solution has to incorporate ways to deconstruct those structures of power. I honestly think that we're not very close to a solution, but I think that if we're not blunt about the basis on which a solution is going to have to be established, we're going to get nowhere. We're going to continue with airy-fairy talk about a two-state solution that everybody knows is not going to happen. The emperor has absolutely no clothes, butt naked. And we keep talking about the beauty of the emperor's clothes. Please, please, if you want a two-state solution, I have no problem. I have 1, 2, 3, 5, however many states. I have no problem with that. Start systematically dismantling the structures the United States has helped to erect to prevent a two-state solution. I mean, that some of those things are down to Congress, actually. And many of those things have to do with the changes that both Danny and Zena have correctly talked about in terms of public opinion. We've now had 2 sets of elections in which people have stood up and said things in terms of Palestinian rights and mild criticisms of Israel and have gotten reelected. Why? Because the Democratic Party base is changing. Why? Because young people are smarter than their elders, more worldly, more knowledgeable, and more have a deeper sense of the importance of equity and justice. That's why we had Black Lives Matter. And that's why we're having this conversation at all. There never was a situation where people in Congress have won re-election in situations where they stood up for Palestinian rights. I remember the days when anybody who did that, the Pete McCloskeys and the senators and congressmen who dared to stand up, they were destroyed, primaried or defeated. That's not happening anymore. That's really, really important. And I think, frankly, it's time for Congress, it's time for American politicians to recognize that they can get a little bit out ahead of the curve on this. Why? Because their constituents will support them if they are blunt about these things. So I'm actually very optimistic not in the short term. We have a miserable situation in Palestine in terms of Palestinian leadership, an abysmal situation. We have an Israeli body politic that's moving continuously to the right. And we have a lack, frankly, of leadership from this country, from Europe, and from other international actors, the Russians and the Chinese as well, in terms of seeing how important this issue is. It really, really is important. Even though it's not a crisis now, and everybody's hoping it'll just go away while they deal with more important things. It is really, really important. It's important in the Middle East. It's important globally. It's become a touchstone for a lot of people in terms of a number of issues involving race and inequality and so on and so forth. And so the United States gets out in front on this, and it's seen as leading in a way that it's not seen as leading with countries that, you know, are in any case enemies of the United States or the United States has problems with, and it's perfectly easy to criticize their human rights abuses. It's very nice to see the Biden administration talking about human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia. And that's the point. Allies, countries that depend on us, countries that are related to us, are the ones that the United States should be talking about, not countries that it's rivals with or it has terrible relations with. We have no effect on, little limited effect on Myanmar or China's internal politics. We have enormous effect on Egypt or Saudi Arabia or Israel or Turkey's internal treatment of people in terms of human rights. So that's where I think we should be focusing as an American people, as Congress, as people concerned about this issue.
Thanks, Rashid. So we have, I think we have a little bit of time left over where we can do sort of a lightning round before we close. So Rashid, if I could just stay with you for a minute and ask you to be as brief as you can on this question of debating this issue in this country. Obviously, you've followed this issue for a long time. You know, I was too young to remember, but you know, based on my research, there was a time when this issue could be debated in the halls of Congress much more openly than it can be today. Is that also your impression? Or what is the state of the debate today? Is there space for debate? And how should we go about having that debate? For example, you know, should Congress be holding hearings on issues, you know, related to Israel-Palestine, on the range of issues that we're looking at today and in this series? But if you could give us, you know, in a minute or two, how you see that debate going about.
Well, I won't talk about Congress. I'll talk about the debate generally. One of the things I have noticed on college campuses and public opinion generally is a much greater willingness to talk about things that people were actually afraid to talk about in the past. The very fact that we even use the A word, the apartheid word, is an indication of the fact that the goalposts have moved a great deal. And I think that's a wonderful thing. I hope it will affect the political level. I should say that the political level has something to do with this because there are efforts to shut down that debate by claiming that anybody who says certain things is anti-Semitic. Anybody who criticizes Israel, anybody who says certain things about Zionism is an anti-Semite. Similarly, there are attempts to shut down boycott, divestment, and sanction. Boycott is as American as apple pie. You would not have had a civil rights movement without boycott. You would not have had Irish liberation without boycott. You would not have had Indian or South African independence without boycott. Boycott should be a sacred thing. And here we have people trying to stop BDS in American state legislatures, and there's a bill before Congress. So I think that there is an openness to debate that wasn't there in decades previous. And I think that there's a determined effort to shut it down, essentially by smearing people with this accusation of anti-Semitism, which is ludicrous because I promise you, it's not in the movement for Palestinian rights and anti-Semitism. It's at Charlottesville. It's among the hard right, neo-Nazi white supremacists that you have real, serious anti-Semitism, murderous anti-Semitism. So there is space, I think, but we have to fight against attempts to shut it down. And the First Amendment should protect us. Courts have again and again found you can't do this and keep in keeping with our Constitution.
So Danny, I want to ask you to talk a little bit more about that, this idea of what I call the conflation of criticism of Israel and activism with anti-Semitism. And I mean, you watch this as much as I do online. We've seen, people like our friend Matt Duss, my predecessor in my current job, our friend Maher Bitar, who we've known for years in the administration and Congress, our friend Rima Dodine, who we know in Congress. Right now, Ben Rhodes, who's being attacked for comments he made in a podcast with Peter Beinart, a Foundation for Religious Peace broadcast. The way people are now, in my world that I see interpreting the people who attack us, they look at the IRHA definition, this International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition. They say, if you're only talking about Israel, you have to be an anti-Semite, which means, Danny Seidemann, your focus on Jerusalem makes you an anti-Semite. Can you respond to that?
Again, I will voluntarily step on a landmine and say, look, I'm a Zionist because my grandfather was a German soldier in World War I. My father grew up in Nazi Germany, escaped in 1940 via Moscow, Peking to Seattle, and my father was back in Germany as an American soldier in 1944. I think the Jewish people needs to be able to defend itself. I think, by the way, the Palestinian people needs to defend itself equally. This is a dangerous world. I am sensitive to anti-Semitism. And yes, I've encountered anti-Semitism in the work that I've done. But what we're witnessing, Lara, is exactly as you have said it, is an attempt to abuse anti-Semitism by, in order to stifle any criticism of Israel, full stop. That does not make the criticism, it doesn't tar the criticism. It whitewashes anti-Semitism. If everything is anti-Semitism, nothing is anti-Semitism. I'm a Zionist. When I hear from Palestinian friends, I oppose Zionism, that is not anti-Semitism. I can understand that. When you criticize the racism that is becoming rampant in Israel, that is not anti-Semitism. We need to be held accountable. Yesterday, our illustrious prime minister put out a condolence note on Twitter for the great luminary, Rush Limbaugh. He didn't do it privately. He did it as the prime minister of Israel. He spoke for me. He's turning us into a wholly owned subsidiary of the Tepech Fresser right in the United States and globally. Israel needs to be held accountable. Let me just give you one example to show you that I'm not exactly tone deaf to this issue. A few years back, I had a conversation with a senior minister in the government of the United Kingdom. And he will remain nameless, although all sorts of people are nudging me to say who it was. And he said, Danny, this conflict will never end because the Jews own Congress and the Jews own the media. That is anti-Semitism because it invokes tropes that go back centuries. Had he said, the Israel lobby has an inordinate amount of influence that creates obstacles for forward progress, I would have no problem with that. We need to be able to identify anti-Semitism when it exists and never to abuse it. Look, I encounter, I'm a prolific tweeter. Lara, you're to blame. And when I encounter anti-Semitism, and I do on occasion, not often, my allies are my Palestinian friends. They're the first to rush to say, you are sullying our cause. Don't allow the anti-Semitism excuse to prevent what we need most, and that is an honest engagement, holding us accountable for what we're doing.
Thanks, Danny. We have time, I think, for 1 minute. I want to put the same question to Zena, where you see the state of the debate now, and where there's potential for things to go.
Yeah, sure. I'll keep it brief. I think it's clear that Palestine-Israel is becoming a partisan issue in the US. And although that has been celebrated by the Israeli right, because it means they get further along on their agenda with an administration like Donald Trump's, it also makes it actually easier to speak about Palestine, because we're in a situation now where Palestine is a progressive issue. This is true across the United States, and it's true across the Western world. It's always sort of been true in the global South. But Palestine is a progressive issue. You know, you can't talk about climate justice, you can't talk about mass incarceration, you can't talk about police brutality without being able to have a sort of honest appraisal of how that operates in Palestine, Israel. And that's exactly why, you know, this the oft-cited example, but, you know, when you had the protests in Ferguson, Palestinians in the West Bank were tweeting about how to, you know, avoid being debilitated by tear gas. It's because we understand the same structures. These are structural violences. And I think, you know, the fact that it's a progressive issue finally is actually recentering what the historic Palestinian debate was, which is anti-colonial, anti-imperial, freedom-loving. And that's something which I think all oppressed groups really understand. And I think it's just a final comment, and it's a really bleak note to end, but, you know, MEI and FMEP will both know I write extensively on climate change in Palestine. Climate change is a serious threat across the Middle East. This is not something, you know, however we're talking about the two-state solution or whatever, like these might be contemporary discourses, but I think in the next 10 to 50 years, the discourse is going to be about climate change. It's going to be about decrease in water supplies, warmer temperatures. It's going to be about how the privileged continue to get resources and then the underprivileged continue to be marginalized. It's going to be a sort of wide and pre-existing inequalities. And so I think, you know, Palestine should be a progressive issue, because when we speak about justice, we don't just speak about justice for Palestinians. We're really talking about justice for everybody. Me being free makes you being free, you know? And I think that's something which is not a politically sexy message, but I think it's kind of a state of the world.
That is a really, really good note to end on. Thank you so much. And I wish we could go on for another couple of hours, but we can't. So we're going to end it here. On behalf of the Foundation for Middle East Peace and Middle East Institute, I want to thank our participants, Zena, Khalid, and Danny. Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who joined us for this webinar. We hope you enjoyed today's session. We hope to see you again next Friday at the same time, same place, for the next session in the teach-in, which will be focused on the Gaza Strip, featuring Omar Shaban, Jihad Abu Salim, and Tanya Hari. And with that, we will end this session. So thanks so much to everybody.